Everybody on Sanctuary Online. Hi, everybody in person. I'm Minister Charlie Reap, they, them pronoun user. I am bringing some dorky stuff today. I'm super excited to be resuming my Sunday school lesson series on the superpowers of the ancient world. So, if you're just now joining us, this is the third out of four where we're going through some superpowers of the ancient world. We started with ancient Egypt, and then we did Canaan, and now we're on Assyria. So it is Star Wars themed. So our yeah, at the risk of getting copyright, no. So the theme was basically like the whole series started back last time I gave a sermon where I basically introduced the idea of a new scope for Sunday school because like we don't know enough history to understand the Bible, and even if we did study history in like the public school system or the private school, whatever you did, like we didn't study it along with the Bible. And so we read a lot of this stuff and we're like, what happened? And we're also kind of like, well, why do we need to know what happened a long time ago in a galaxy? I'm sorry, an area far, far away. But basically, we need to be able to understand the history of the world in order to understand the Bible. So, like I said, if you aren't familiar with Star Wars, that's totally fine. This is why I asked you to make the candles red, by the way. So, yeah, like I said, if you're not familiar with Star Wars, totally fine. We'll make this reference and we'll go from there. For any Star Wars fans watching, that is Darth Vader, but I'm specifically associating Assyria with his lightsaber. Keep listening to find out why, and feel free to drop your observation in the comments. So, without further ado, I will mention this at the end of the presentation, but I primarily got my information from two sources. So one of them is called The World's History Textbook by Howard Spodek. And then I also have my really beat up copy of the 2008 NIV Study Bible, which I have turned to a page all about Assyria, which y'all cannot see from here. But basically, that's a super, super helpful resource for it. If you don't have either of those resources, that's totally fine. I linked to some online resources later at the end of this presentation. Join our Discord if you want to access the Discord. Obviously, yes, join our Discord to access our Discord. We have lots of fun. But anyways, join our Discord to get access to the presentation because we usually upload all of our stuff to there anyways. So what we're going to cover today is 5 things. We're going to talk about Assyria's territory, so how much land did they cover at the height of their power, the time frame, so how long did the Assyrian Empire last, contributions, what were the Assyrians known for, references, where is Assyria mentioned in the Bible, and then impact, how did the Israelites encounter the Assyrians in the Bible. Are we going to change the slides? There we go. Okay, so caveat before we get started. So this Sunday school lesson contains information that we know to be true right now. There might be future discoveries that fill in some gaps or force us to reevaluate some things, but for now it's accurate based on the information that's publicly available. There we go. So 3 things to keep in mind. These civilizations are ancient as heck. So archaeologists may not know the precise year that like a kingdom was established or a transition period began. I rounded the numbers anyway, so it's a little bit easier to comprehend. This is a big one. A lot of evidence has been lost, destroyed, or yet to be discovered. So archaeologists have made educated guesses to fill in the gaps. Keep in mind the Assyrian Empire occupied the land that is now Iraq, and given the history of conflict in that country, there's a lot of evidence that has been, decimated because of war. And then absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So in other words, just because archaeologists haven't found proof that something happens doesn't necessarily mean that the thing didn't happen. Okay, now, so the fun part. We're diving in. So first of all, we're going to start with the geography. So where Assyria started and how widely the empire spread. Wow. Yeah, okay, so yeah, it eventually took all of that. For anybody who... Oh, yeah, so this is actually not even at the height of its power because it didn't go all the way down in here. But I have to start us with the very, very, very beginning of Assyria. So I want to emphasize that people didn't stay in one place in ancient times. They actually migrated for a lot of different reasons. And so the Assyrians' descendants, the Akkadians, were actually some migratory people. So they came from the Arabian Peninsula, which it's not on the map, but it's like Saudi Arabia at the very tip of that. And they came to the Persian Gulf, which is like right over here. It's where Sumer and some of the first civilizations in Mesopotamia were. So they came there in about 2350 BC. They took over existing cities, like I said, in Sumer, and be calling the land Akkad, Akkad. That's where the name Akkadian comes from. Yes. Yes. So the Akkadians eventually created an empire that controlled much of the Fertile Crescent, which is like the nice non-desert bit that goes from like the Mediterranean Sea over here where Canaan is, up through what's now like Syria, Iraq, Iran, and then all the way down into the Persian Gulf. So that is, well, and then of course the Akkadian Empire, like most empires, ended up falling. So fast forward about 400 years, the Akkadians' descendants have created an independent state out of the city of Ashur, also known as Assur, which is where the word Assyria comes from. So Ashur is in modern day Iraq. If y'all can see it on the map, it's like right there. It's very close to, it's like, I think that's like 60 miles from Nineveh or something like that. Yeah, it's... Which then eventually became the capital. Exactly, which I'll get into in a little bit. So Ashur would be the Assyrian capital for a while. Yep. But it would remain the empire's religious and spiritual center. So I don't know if y'all online can see the map on the screen. That's why I highly suggest, joining our Discord. This will be in the resources channel. But for those of y'all who are in person, so like this little purple area right here, and I'm gonna actually move over so you can see. Tiny little purple area is the Assyrian heartland, which is where most of their power was concentrated. Let's see, again, centered around Ashur, which is right there. And then I like this map because it shows like how it expanded and shrank. This is only like in the middle Assyrian Empire, which is, what's up? Yes, can you see Nina? I can see. Okay. So this isn't even like the height of its power. It eventually like expanded all the way into here, but I also like that you can see what empires are nearby. So you've got Babylon that's down here. You've got the Mitanni right there. The Hittites are up here. So like eventually they would just expand and contract, but like you see how small it started out as. Yeah. Huh? It is a baby. It's a very powerful baby. It became this huge, brutal force. Wow. It did. And actually, fun fact, y'all can't see it from way down here, but down here in Egypt, it says the New Kingdom of Egypt. If you remember from our Sunday school on ancient Egypt, they were having their heyday during the New Kingdom period. So while Egypt was like living it up with all of this control, Assyria was like, all right, we're gonna like expand our empire a little bit. They were just getting started. Let's see. So then as centuries went on, Assyria conquered Babylon, Canaan, Anatolia, which is like part of Turkey, and eventually Egypt, which is fascinating. Oh, so also, fun fact about them conquering Babylon, they did it a couple times. One king decided to form an alliance with the Babylonians, and they became a combined force to be reckoned with. Not every king was so strategic. So a later king, Sennacherib, who is going to pop up a lot in this history lesson. Yeah, he decided to sack Babylon and carry off its wealth, and it didn't turn out well. His sons eventually assassinated him, and, It did not? No, it did not. Yeah. Sennacherib was also the one who relocated the capital from Ashur to Nineveh. So he's just like, I'm gonna move it here. He also decided to build like a grand old palace. What's up?
Is this also where we get like Ashur poles or whatever they were called?
That's a great question.
I don't know. That's a good question.
They do have they have very. I know Ashur is Ashur. That is the national deity of Assyria. I will actually have to look into more of that. Thank you.
Really quick.
Yes. Oh, and by the way, so after after they moved the Syrian capital to Nineveh, literally less than 100 years later, Nineveh fell, and so did the rest of the Assyrian Empire.
It looks
Didn't
like
last.
they are Canaanite,
Ah,
and it was in tribute to the goddess Asherah. But it does say there is an Akkadian form, and
that would help.
was a goddess in the ancient Semitic religion. So what I'm going to say is that it probably didn't originate with them, but they probably borrowed on it at some point in time.
I was gonna say they all mixed because
Right, Ashur, and it says here consort is Assur, the Assyrian religion. So in other words,
There we go.
Assur, Asshur,
Yeah.
Ashur was their god, and so
Mhm.
Asherah was the goddess. So it all kind of, and so that actually probably is the Assyrian word, which I'm not going to segue, but this is actually making me think a lot about the fact that if we can study some of these ancient languages, it might be interesting because the Bible is not just in Hebrew.
right.
There's a lot of these other languages and references to a lot of these other things.
Yeah.
In it.
So we always learn stuff that's fun at Sanctuary. So yeah,
was fun.
It was fun. So now that you know the general, like how the empire rose and fell, it fell very, very, very quickly. We're going to jump into the actual time frames and like historical contributions. So the Assyrian, there's like really no good way to stand over here. So the Assyrian Empire lasted about 1,400 years, which you think is a long time, but then considering Egypt was like double that, and like Egypt lasted a really long time. Still, 1,400 years with kind of primitive technology is nothing to sneeze at.
Right.
So I'm going to break down the time periods. There's actually only like 3 we really need to talk about. But basically, the Akkadian Empire dissolved in about 2150 BC, and like I said, the Akkadians were the ancestors of the Assyrians. I forgot what word to use, but yes. You got the old Assyrian period when Ashur emerges as a city-state, but then it fades into obscurity when the Mitanni Empire takes over. And the Mitanni were like, if you remember from that map, they were like right beside. They were like, yeah, they were like shoving elbows and stuff like that. Yeah. And then the little tribe. I mean, they all started out as little tribes that could, and then just. So 1350 BC, the Middle Assyrian period starts. Assyria regains its independence and it begins conquering the surrounding lands. So this period ends when the Arameans take over. And then coming up on 900 BC is the Neo-Assyrian period, which is like when, if we think of the Assyrian Empire, we're thinking of the Neo-Assyrian period. So this is the height of the Assyrian Empire. A bunch of kings expanded their territory. They took over the kingdoms of Judah and Israel, which we'll talk about later. They also expanded into Egypt, which is insanity. So I actually wanted to highlight a few kings from the Neo-Assyrian period. Look, it's our guy Sennacherib, once again. He made Nineveh the capital, and he also built the so-called palace without rival. I couldn't find a really good picture of it, unfortunately, but he might have been a fun person to hang around, I guess. Sarcastically. Yeah, he seemed to have a lot of hubris, so. Just a little, yeah, it's a lot. There's Esarhaddon, you gotta, please forgive my pronunciations. So he conquered Egypt in 671 BC. So like all the way down there, they were just like, okay, we're just gonna expand. And then there's Ashurbanipal. So the world history textbook that I read said he was one of the only literate kings. Nick, you're gonna find this very, very fascinating. So not only did he build a great library at Nineveh, which you would find fascinating, that library is where the archaeologists have found the earliest complete version of the Epic of Gilgamesh. So that was pretty cool. The Bible also mentions a few Assyrian kings, but we'll get to them a little bit later. And so now it's time to talk about my favorite segment so far. Siege ramps! You knew this was coming.
I did not.
Okay. Anyway.
No, I did not.
Anyway, I've been obsessed with the Assyrian siege ramps for a bit, ever since I learned about their existence.
We tried to find you a model scale.
I
siege ramp.
appreciate that. You
But it doesn't
did.
exist.
It doesn't exist.
It's okay.
And
I'll
we're
talk.
not just taking you to a quarry. Okay?
Oh no, I've come up. I found the research, the formula to make a siege ramp in 25 days. So, getting ahead of myself. Getting ahead of myself. Yes.
We're going to talk about
So-
that later.
Basically, the reason that I compared the Assyrian Empire to Darth Vader and his lightsaber is because the Assyrians' like military technology was just incomprehensible. So they revolutionized siege warfare in the time, and let me explain how that happens. So we don't think of ancient cultures as being technologically advanced, but there's a reason why, like, the Assyrian Empire lasted for 1,400 years. Assyria was known for its siege ramps. So back in the day, a lot of cities were built on hilltops and surrounded by walls for protection. If you've read the story of Jericho from the Bible, or if you've seen VeggieTales and remember that episode, that's we're talking about these massive fortified cities, walls around the whole thing. There's maybe like one gate that you can go through. When you've got a big wall around your city, the only way to get in is through the front door, but that's where all the soldiers are going to be, so it's not the most effective way to get inside. So your army could camp around the walled city and you just wait people out, but that's a risk because your soldiers might starve before the city surrenders. So the Assyrians took an offensive approach to siege warfare. And all this information comes from an article called Siege Ramps and Breached Walls, Ancient Warfare and the Assyrian Conquest of Lachish by Hebrew University of Jerusalem. I linked this article here at the end of the presentation. I find it fascinating, but, you know. So basically, archaeologists at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem excavated a site around the city of Lachish, like back in 2021. Like that's when the article came out. It's very recent. So the siege of Lachish is mentioned in 2 Kings 18 through 19, 2 Chronicles 32, and Isaiah 36 through 37. So basically, the archaeologists theorized that the Assyrians built a massive ramp up the hill to reach the city walls. Then they would drag a battering ram up, knock it into the wall until they were able to breach the city. Other sources add that the Assyrians would have targeted the ramparts or upper sections where the walls were the thinnest. Yes?
Wouldn't the armies like it seen them coming? This is a lot of premeditated stuff.
Yes. They would have, the closer they get to the walls, the soldiers, like the Assyrian soldiers, would put like basically shields over them to protect themselves. So yeah. So like the enemy archers are firing like, I think they're firing like arrows dipped in fire, but they're able to like bounce off because of shields.
And so, like, in other words, they're going to run out eventually. And
Think Lord of the Rings. Yeah.
They're sieging and they're building this invasive ramp, so the people can't really leave the city.
Nope.
And get more supplies.
Nope.
So they're going to eventually run out of all their little fiery darts.
Yep.
And they're going to keep going. That was actually very smart.
There's also, I believe, don't quote me on this, it's giving Lord of the Rings Battle of Helm's Deep when the orcs are going in to storm the city, and they're like going, it's in the movie, so yeah, which I know you haven't seen, but for anyone listening online, it's giving the orcs are trying to storm the city, break into this castle. They're using a battering ram. They also used a whole bunch of other things like to undermine either, I believe the Assyrians would set fire to the city gates. Because they're made of wood. It's like you burn the city gates, you can get right through. So basically they did a lot of offensive approaching to getting into these walled cities.
But I mean, like, they had to think about, like, all right, well, we're going to do this, but we're going to do this so that they probably also started sometimes at night. A lot of times you read that they see stuff at night, but it's
but they're
not going to be done overnight. They're not going to work on this from midnight to 5 a.m. and things going to be there. But
which is what we're getting into.
It's like you're very excited about this.
I am very excited.
It's like at the same time, hey, use all your weapons and kind of make them run out of supplies. Wow, we're going to do this at the same time.
Yes.
So it's
yes.
very, very tactical.
It's very tactical, and it's like you kind of wonder why Assyria didn't last longer, but it's like, well, God intervened, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. So back to siege warfare. When you don't have machines to do all your building, because keep in mind, they were doing all this stuff by hand. They didn't have like excavators and bulldozers to be able to do all this. And so the archaeologists figured that the Assyrians found an exposed cliff nearby, chipped off boulders that weighed about 15 pounds each, and passed them along human chains until they got to a spot about 260 feet away from the wall. What?
Oh, they have to be strong to lift
Yeah,
them.
oh
They
yeah,
invented the
all
chain
day,
gang.
every day. They would use like prisoners of war and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, they were.
Doesn't it sound familiar?
Yeah.
To that part of the world?
Well, we always fight.
More power, more land, more control.
I mean, that's kind of what every country does. I mean, if the United States wasn't surrounded all by water, we'd be doing the same thing. So, but they passed the rocks to about 260 feet away from the city walls, and they started to pile them up. They needed 3 million stones to be able to build a complete siege ramp. They were able to do that in less than a month by having 4 human chains working in 12-hour shifts around the clock.
Okay, but where did they get 3 million rocks from?
The quarries. Like they chipped off the stone. They had enough exposed bedrock that they were able to just.
Right, but you have to get it from the quarries to the people.
They had human gangs set up from the quarry
From the
to.
quarry all the way. Wow.
Yeah.
I'm still stuck on that thing. Yeah.
Oh, and that's not the best part. We haven't talked about the battering rams yet. So, the ramps alone are an insane feat of engineering.
Yes.
So the battering ram, sources have described them as quote unquote engines. They were actually multi-story towers with wheels on the bottom, a turret on the top. The whole thing weighed about a ton. Yes, and it had to be set on massive wooden beams close to the wall so that it wouldn't be like toppled over. But this thing is like a siege tower in 8th century BC. Insanity.
It's reminding me of the Earth Kingdom, the Fire Nation invading the Earth Kingdom with like that drone.
A little bit, yeah. I
Wow.
mean,
This is just like mind-boggling. Okay.
oh, and then we haven't talked about the actual. So after you got the tower, right? Then there's the beam that actually like knocks into the wall. That thing had a metal tip, because this is like during the time when iron was really being developed, and the Assyrians knew how to produce iron weapons. They mass produced their iron weapons. So the actual battering ram, the big old log, had a metal tip on the end, and they had metal chains around it so that it wouldn't like fall off. And sometimes these siege towers would have 2 battering rams. So if you can imagine being a tiny little city and you're looking out, your people are starving, and you're seeing this Assyrian army moving all of these stones up to your city, and then you see the big old towers, and you're like, oh, we're done for. I understand now why some of these Israelite and Judean kings were all terrified out of their mind during this time. And then, of course, I also talked about you've got the siege ramps. You also have mass-produced iron weapons, which the Assyrians fought with. They were superior to bronze, and they could be mass-produced. So the Assyrian army was really ahead of its time. I'm sorry, what?
An infection. A lot of people probably died of tetanus and infection.
Oh, probably.
They weren't clean, and you probably have stuff rusted.
Oh, yeah.
They didn't go, oh, it's getting rusty, we're not going to use it anymore.
Right, they kept, yeah.
Yeah, and blood contamination. And
Oh, yeah.
How unclean when we talk about the laws and stuff, war really, really is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So that's siege warfare. Thank y'all for sticking with it. It's basically giving Game of Thrones meets Lord of the Rings. And Attack on Titan. Thank you, Nick. But now we're going to move on to the references. So surprisingly, Assyria is only mentioned 132 times. But
That's it.
but we're not counting all the facts. Jonah's not even on this list, and Jonah is all about ministering to the people of Nineveh. Nineveh is the capital of Syria, and Jonah doesn't even appear on the list.
There's a lot of prophecy about Nineveh and a lot of the cities.
Right, and I didn't even look up anything about Nineveh. I literally just Like, I typed into Bible Google, I was like, Assyria, 132 references. And then I typed in these king names, and they got some for me. But basically, the first time Assyria is mentioned is in the genealogy of Noah. It's in the Table of Nations passage with Nimrod. Nimrod is said to have gone to Assyria, built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Kala, and Rezin. So that's in Genesis 10. But most of the references to Assyria are found in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. The rest are from the prophetic writings, which I put a list down here. Isaiah has 41 mentions of Assyria. That's the most. And
That makes sense.
yeah, because he ministered at the time that Ahaz was king. Ahaz made, for God's people, he made a blunder. I mean, he probably did what a lot of other military strategists would do in his day, and he allied himself with a larger empire in order to stave off attacks from neighboring kingdoms. But God did not like that, and bad things happened. Let's see. I mean, bad kingdom, bad. So,
Bad things happen.
yes. So specific kings are mentioned in a few places. Tiglath-Pileser III, he was the one who sided with Ahaz against the kingdoms of Aram and Israel. So keep in mind, Ahaz was the king of Judah. And so Judah and Israel were at war with each other. And Israel's like, hey, I want to get this other guy. I believe Aram is also Syria, like ancient Syria at this time. But basically, Ahaz is like, Assyria, please, I'm being attacked from all sides. Please form an alliance with me. And they're like, all right. But I think what ended up happening is that, and I think I talk about this a little bit later, but the political situation does not get any better after Ahaz allies with Assyria. If anything, it gets worse because they're levying huge taxes against the people. It's bad. So, lesson learned, trust God, don't trust all these other empires. Easier said than done. Let's see. Oh, yes. Tiglath-Pileser III also annexed a lot of northern Israel during the reign of Pekah, leaving only central Israel and Samaria intact, and that's in 2 Kings 15 through 16 and 1 Chronicles 5. Let's see who else we got. Shalmaneser V rose up against Israel when Hoshea withheld the nation's annual tribute, which is also, I believe he was the last king of Israel. Yeah. So
Who's in there somewhere?
yeah. So basically, Hoshea was like, I don't want to pay you my annual tribute. And they're like, you messed up. And so a little bit, yeah. Arlong from One Piece.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, pay the tribute or you die.
I mean, pretty much.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, that's about when, Sargon II finished what Shalmaneser started, and he saw the fall of Israel. So, Sargon is actually mentioned in a prophecy against Egypt and Cush in Isaiah 20. Yes. And then once again, our hubris man, Sennacherib. He conquered Judah during the reign of Hezekiah. So that is in 2 Kings 18 through 19, 2 Chronicles 32, and Isaiah 36 and 37. Okay. Try this again. Impact. Here we go. So I find this part really fascinating. It like Assyria had more of an impact, I think, than a lot of the other, or it had a longer lasting impact, I think, on God's people than maybe Egypt did, or at least in my research. So, I mean, there's a lot to unpack here. First of all, being an ancient superpower, Assyria was both a source of terror and hope. So God's people got into a lot of trouble, like I said, with Ahaz, trying to form alliances with Assyria instead of relying on God. So, like I said, Ahaz, he asked Assyria for help against the kingdoms of Israel and Aram, and he paid the price. He paid the price by becoming an Assyrian vassal. So, Encyclopedia Britannica notes that the situation did not get any better under Assyrian rule. If anything, it got worse because they had to pay large sums of money as tribute and put up with Assyrian gods being placed in the temple. So, that was a bad thing. But for what it's worth, Assyria didn't get off scot-free. So even though they delivered divine punishments for the Israelites' idolatry, God still held them accountable for their actions. And I put a bunch of Bible verses over here that reference it. like I said, join the Discord, online folks, and you can get access to the presentation and be able to read some of this for yourself. But one of the most long-lasting impacts of the Assyrian Empire was when, with God's people are concerned, was with the exile. I'm not going to delve into this too much here because this is going to be the subject of another Sunday school series. But at this time, the Israelites were divided into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. The kingdom of Israel, I believe, had 10 of the 12 tribes, and then Judah had 2 of them. So Judah's claimed lineage through like the house of David, and then Israel just kind of did its own thing. Now, Assyria took Israel into captivity first. So the kingdom of Israel fell first. If you think of the letter A, starting the first letter of the alphabet, I comes before J. So like Assyria and Israel fell together. You have a better mnemonic device, but it's not exactly church appropriate. So you can share it in the Discord. That'll be a nice little like teaser for y'all to join. And then Judah would last like maybe 150 years or something like that. But then they would be taken into exile by Babylon. But basically, the people who were carried back from Israel, the kingdom of Israel, assimilated, and they became known as the 10 lost tribes of Israel because they just like completely lost their identity. It's not like 10 lost as in, oh, where did they go? Like they went to Assyria. Like we know they went to Assyria. And
said that.
Yeah.
Because people act like they're like, where in the world is Carmen Sandiego?
Oh,
Like,
that was yeah.
I mean,
oh my God. Yeah, no, it was in that world history textbook. It was great.
Disappeared and
no, they assimilated.
Trying to figure them out. Now they just basically
they lost their identity.
Something else. They lost their identity.
And so Judah became the remnant, and they eventually came back, but that's like an entirely separate.
And then that eventually became kind of assimilated.
Yeah. But I think the biggest takeaway that if you learn anything from the Empire of Assyria and its impact, I might go out on a limb and say that if we didn't have Assyria doing its thing, if Assyria wasn't the big superpower of the world, I mean, it might have been another one, but like we wouldn't have the Bible today. So we have King Josiah to thank, because Josiah reigned around the time when the Assyrians were like really starting to expand their empire. So for reference, King Josiah of Judah reigned during like the 600s BC. And like towards, I believe, 609 is when either the Assyrian Empire fell or when Nineveh fell. It was one of those two. Thank you for looking it up. But basically, like King Josiah reigned around the time that the Assyrian Empire was at its peak, and it hadn't quite crippled. The empire wasn't crippled yet. King Josiah was like, hey, we really want to promote the Israelite religion. We want to promote like our own sense of identity. And so he basically ordered for all of the oral history that had been passing along down to this point to be made into writings. And so that's where we get the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. It's also, the Hebrew Bible is also called the Tanakh. You can explain this better because it's like 3, it's the Torah,
it's Torah, so it's Tanakh, and so it's Torah, and then it's an abbreviation for, the last one is writings.
It's Nevi'im or something like that.
Yeah.
Nevim.
Nevim is the prophets.
And in the middle is like history.
And there's history. And
yeah.
So there's, that's how they divide up Hebrew Bibles, and they call it the Tanakh.
Yeah, and so like our Old Testament is basically,
yeah,
so it's like the first 5 books are the Torah, then you get to all of the, really boring parts, which is all the Chronicles, like the Kings, like the history stuff, and then you get into the prophetic writings. That's basically the Hebrew Bible. That's the Tanakh. And because of Assyria being so large in your face, Josiah's like, we got to write this stuff down, because if we don't have oral history, if like all of our people get scattered, we're not going to have anything. Yeah, and so you can actually read about King Josiah in 2 Kings 20 to 21. Obviously, the entire Bible wasn't written in that short of a span, but it started getting written down there, which I find very interesting because I at least assumed when I was a kid that like, oh, when Abraham was still Abram, that he was like writing down everything like a journal. Like, first of all, Abram probably wasn't literate. He probably didn't know how to read or write. And so like all the people that these books are about probably didn't write stuff down. And so it was just oral tradition passed down through the ages. And that's why you get to a certain point and it's like, oh, okay, this stuff has more detail. Like the Kings and the Chronicles have a lot more detail about being like, oh, X number of years that a king is reigning. Versus you get like Genesis and it's a lot of like really big time skips and not a lot of detail. That's why, because it's oral history.
It's too literate.
Yes. And so that is it for our presentation. We're just going to summarize everything. Thanks for sticking with. But basically, yeah, Assyria was known for its military technology, which it used to expand its empire. The Assyrian Empire lasted 1,400 years, eventually falling to its neighboring empires not long after it reached its peak. And then Assyria is a prominent force in the Old Testament, both in the historical accounts and the prophetic writings. So our final Sunday school is actually going to be on Babylon. It's going to be in December. Next month, we're doing our anniversary service. So stay tuned for that. And then, yeah, we'll finish out this series first Sunday in December. I don't know what date that is.
It's the first.
Oh, cool. December 1st. So we'll see y'all then. In the meantime, stick around because Leanne is going to be giving us I have a feeling,
Right now,
convicting. Thank you. I was like, convicting is the right word.
So in 609 BC, the Medes and Babylonians defeated the Assyrians.
Oh, so Assyria fell in
Assyria
609.
fell under Ashur-uballit II and captured Haran. Ashur-uballit II. You know, that means there was an Ashur-uballit I, and so that's a thought.
Oh, yeah.
The last king of Assyria disappears from history, and it was also the year of the Battle of Megiddo, where King Josiah is killed fighting against Necho II, who was on his way to aid the Assyrian state.
So the Nineveh fell in 612. Yeah, because I remember Nineveh fell before Assyria did.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah.
I just don't remember the year.
Mm-hmm.
Nineveh,
What's up?
So they got destroyed from the inside out.
612 BC.
Pretty
The
much.
city of Nineveh was sacked and burned by the allied forces of the Persians, Medes, Babylonians, and others, who then divided the region between them.
Dang.
It's like World War III.
I mean, if you think about it, all these were world wars because they're all these allied powers
That was
coming out against each other. But thanks for tuning in.
Who's the regular